Hey guys, I'm Naya and welcome back to the channel. We have an important topic to discuss today. I have decided to compile 10 Mystic Mine rulings because Mystic Mine has been a huge topic of discussion in the last week since the YCS and the Sky Striker win and the inclusion of a Mystic Mine, and I like to address it on the channel as well. We discussed about it in the community post that I made, so if you haven't commented your opinion, you can do that as well if you want, and we have some discussions about Mystic Mine. But yeah, I decided to make a video about Mystic Mine rulings. Number one, because I like rulings and they interest me. Number two, because I think it's kind of good to talk about a card that has so many mixed opinions when it comes to it and remind you of certain things that you still maybe need to keep in mind, regardless of whether or not you hate Mine or not. It's still the card in the format, and since the ban list is not exactly approaching, we don't even know if it's going to get hit at any point in time, so it's important to know a couple of rulings, interactions, stuff like that. So even if someone does use Mystic Mine against you or you use it, you want to use it well and you want to know how to play against it. So yeah, with that being said, we can go ahead and get started. But before that, I would like to encourage you, like I said, to comment in the comments, let me know your opinions, and also subscribe because a lot of you are still not, and I would really love for you to be part of this community. So before we begin, once more, as I mentioned in my previous rulings video, I have used the Judges Lounge, the Facebook group, for the help. Basically, I looked through a lot of rulings. Pretty much I scrolled to the point where there was no more content about Mystic Mine. So I checked through everything, and these are the rulings that I'm taking from there. It's not mine, but it's still very, very important. Good to hear everything I've mentioned before. But yeah, I just want to, stress out that it has everything to do with the Judges Lounge, and I'm very much grateful for the group that it exists, everything I have mentioned in the previous rulings video. So we have 10 different rulings, and the first one is going to be Therian King Regulus versus Mystic Mine. So essentially the question is, if I use Therian King Regulus' effect to negate the Mystic Mine, what happens? And essentially the answer is that Therian King Regulus would just be wasted because his effect works in a way that it negates the effect that was applied as the previous chain link. So essentially when the previous chain link resolves, and the effect that's applied at that point will get negated by Therian King Regulus, but because Mystic Mine's effect is continuous, nothing really happens on activation, so there's nothing to negate. And immediately after the chain resolves, Mystic Mine would continue to apply as per usual. And also, Therian King Regulus will not be able to negate the end phase effect that actually activates, because like I said, Therian King Regulus essentially just negates the effect that would be applied immediately upon the resolution of the preceding chain link. So it has really nothing to do with the end phase effect anymore. And at that point in time, it will be wasted. So, don't try to negate Mystic Mine with Therian King Regulus because it's just not gonna do you any good. And the next one is going to be Blizzard versus Mystic Mine. And this is pretty much almost the same as Therian King Regulus, but basically Blizzard negates the activated effects and the effects of spell cards on the field with the same name. And since Mystic Mine's effect is continuous, Blizzard will not negate it. However, different from Therian King Regulus, Blizzard would be able to negate the activated effect in the end phase where Mystic Mine destroys itself because it is activated, and Blizzard will still negate that activated effect. So essentially that's not an out to Mystic Mine. It isn't going to do anything. So if you want Mystic Mine to remain on field, I guess that would be the only way to use Blizzard to your advantage, like if you just want the Mine to remain face up for whichever reason, because it is going to only be able to negate the activated effect in the end phase. And then the next one, very brief one, how do monsters work under Mystic Mine that place counters on themselves? And the answer would be, since placing counters is usually not an activated effect, I'm not entirely sure if there is a card. Let me know down in the comments that has an activated effect that places counters, but if it's not, which usually isn't, and I have an example here with Jackal King, it doesn't place counters on itself as an activated effect, so counters would be placed normally under Mystic Mine. The next one is going to be with Field Barrier. So there's two parts. Field Barrier would protect Mystic Mine from destroying itself in the end phase. And the other one would be that if you were to use Twin Twisters against Mystic Mine and Field Barrier, you cannot destroy both of them simultaneously, because Field Barrier needs to actually be off the field to be able to not provide that protection anymore. It needs to be completely off the field. So even if they will be destroyed at the same time, I guess, with Twin Twisters, Field Barrier will still prevent mine from being destroyed. So if you were to use Twin Twisters, you could effectively get rid only of the Field Barrier, and then you'd have to use another thing to out that Mystic Mine. Then we have unaffected monsters versus Mystic Mine. And how that works and how that can be easily explained is that Mystic Mine does not affect monsters. It also doesn't affect the player. This is a term that's used a lot, but doesn't really stand for anything. Essentially, how it's usually explained is that cards either affect cards or they don't. And in that case, Mystic Mine does not affect the actual monsters, so they are still considered under the Mystic Mine's restriction. They cannot use effects and they cannot attack, but that is because the player cannot declare an attack or activate monster effects. So it's not that Mine would be affecting those monsters, and that's why it can go around their own protection. Then I wanted to point out two cards that actually are able to negate the Mystic Mine with their continuous effect, and the keyword is continuous because their effects, they are monsters, but their effects are not activated effects. And since they say that they negate the opponent's field spells or the spell effects on the field, in the case of Gate Blocker and Spell Canceller, with their continuous effects, they are able to negate Mystic Mine. Then we have two rulings with Masquerade the Blazing Dragon and also a Mystic Mine, because this is an example that is going to come up with the current metagame we are in. And there's two parts to this. So Masquerade's effect, where your opponent needs to where your opponent needs to pay 600 life points to be able to activate their effect and cards, that still happens. They still need to pay because it's not an activated effect. It just makes it so your opponent cannot even do anything unless they pay that 600 life points. So Mine cannot prevent you from, you know, being able to use Masquerade to your advantage that way. Mine doesn't do anything to it. Your opponent still needs to pay 600. And there's the other Masquerade thing as well, in the end phase where Mine activates. Basically, I found a question where someone asked whether or not Mine checks in every single end phase for Masquerade to actually be able to burn your opponent 600 every single end phase as per Mine's mandatory check. But that's not exactly a thing, because if you and your opponent do not control the same number of monsters, and this is going to be important for another ruling we're about to talk about, Mine doesn't check. If you don't have the same number of monsters as your opponent, Mine doesn't even meet its activation condition for the effect to destroy itself. So it is going to activate only and only if both of you control the same number of monsters. And at that point, of course, Masquerade will be able to burn you for 600 life points, but without it, Mine doesn't check in every single end phase. And now we're gonna go over one very interesting one before we get to the last one, which is also interesting and kind of in-depth. So one quick one before we go into that. Basically, the question was posed whether or not, if you attempt to activate Mystic Mine, is the Mystic Mine actually on the field, being a spell card, a field spell card, whatever it may be, it's not a monster. And we all know if the monster is attempting to be summoned and the summon gets negated, the monster was never on the field. And the question was, if I activate Mystic Mine and my opponent attempts to negate the activation with something like Wandering Griffin Rider, it could be anything else like Boreal Savage Dragon, something like that, can I use Infinite Impermanence because I technically don't control any cards yet? But it's not exactly the case, because the moment that Mystic Mine is placed on the field, it's actually on the field. So it's not like monsters where there is still a chance for it to not be on the field if the summon gets negated. With Mystic Mine, for example, being not a monster, this is not the case. It's on the field and you cannot use Infinite Impermanence, so the correct way of doing it would be use impermanence first, make sure the monster gets negated, and then you can play your Mystic Mine and not worry about it. Alright, and the last one, maybe you guessed it already, is going to be end phase priority. And how you and your opponent, depending on which one of you is the turn player, need to resolve your effects. And there's a couple things to talk about, and for the last two rulings, I decided to split it between the last two. First, we're going to cover how effects actually resolve, and then we're going to cover what happens if you guys start passing priority. Let's begin with how does everything actually work in a phase? Essentially, you and your opponent are going to pass priority, and the turn player is going to be the first one to do it. And some effects can resolve at any point in the open game state when they expire. Something like Card of Demise, Mystic Mine, you have Amano Ivato, a Widow Anchor, pretty much anything. Like you can think of a lot of things. And the turn player is going to be able to arrange all of these things and use them whenever they want. So if they have one thing to, I guess, take care of, which would be the expiration of Widow Anchor, for example, they need to return that monster to you, and then they can only pass turn. Like, the things that expire need to be taken care of in that phase. However, if they have multiple things that they can arrange however they want, they can choose, because at the end of the day, they want to achieve a favorable outcome for themselves. So if they have 0 monsters, for example, and then they take something of yours, a monster of yours with Widow Anchor, and then you move on to the end phase, but they control Mystic Mine. Maybe they don't want it to get destroyed. So at that point in time, they can choose. They don't need to use that effect. They don't need to pop mine if they don't want to yet, because they have multiple effects that they can resolve. So they can decide, right? They can either return the monster first, and at that point in time, mine is not going to meet its trigger condition to destroy itself because you'd control a different number of monsters. However, if they choose to destroy the mine for whichever reason, they can use the effect first, destroy the mine because you still control the same number, and then they can return the monster to you. So they can make it work for them. And it's pretty much going to be the same if, for example, they need to return a monster of yours because it was banished with Sky Striker Zeke. They can decide to return it first, or they don't do that because maybe they control a different number of monsters, or they still have the Widow Anchor which they need to resolve. But my point is that whatever they want to do, they can do it if they are the turn player, because they can decide when to do things. But then stuff gets a bit more complicated because it does depend who the turn player is. And with that, we're going to jump in the last ruling, which is essentially how the passing of priority works. And you can only do it once. So if, for example, both you and your opponent controlled 2 monsters, let's say, you have 2 monsters and they have Gamma and Driver. You can choose not to use the mine effect yet because you want the Mystic Mine to remain face up on the field. You can pass priority because you're the turn player, you decide to pass priority. Now, your opponent can do one of 2 things. Either resolve their effect where they need to get rid of Gamma and Driver. And if they choose to do that, which they can, mine is going to remain face up on the field. It's going to be in their favor, but I guess you know what you're doing, that's what you want, it's whatever, or maybe that's what they want, but they can choose. However, if they pass priority back to you, you cannot pass it back again. And at that point in time, there is one effect that you need to take care of, and is the destruction of Mystic Mine, because you both control the same number of monsters. You cannot pass priority again, so you need to destroy it. And that is how end phase priority manipulation, I would call it, works. Essentially, if you and your opponent work together to achieve a mutual favorable outcome, that works. But if one of you or both of you don't want to do that, you can do some tricks with priority and with resolving your effect to achieve a good outcome for yourself. So that is something to keep in mind. You can only pass the priority once. And the mandatory effect, especially that actually meets its trigger condition, cannot be ignored. I know that sounds a bit weird, but you cannot leave the phase if the effect is not taken care of. If it's the only one, naturally you're going to have to destroy the Mystic Mine. If it's not, and you are the turn player, you can manipulate things to your advantage. So yes, I think that's it. Hopefully this video was entertaining, but most importantly educational. I really tried to convey everything to the best of my abilities, and like I said, you know, I love this kind of content. I love making it, I love watching it, and if you enjoyed as well, I would greatly appreciate it if you let me know. Also, if I maybe missed anything important, anything you want to share with me, please let me know down in the comments. And yeah, if you like the video, like it, check out all the social media, sub to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace!